Welcome back. This is Chris Fleming for October 2016 of Spirit Talk. Now, everybody knows it's Halloween. It's the time of ghosts, goblins, and more importantly, hauntings, which brings us to this podcast guest. Now, our guest this month is the author of the supernatural trilogy, House of Darkness, House of Light, the true story behind the blockbuster film, The Conjuring. She is also the co-author of the historically based mystery thriller, In a Flicker, written with George R. Lopez. Now, she earned a bachelor's in philosophy and English from Chatham College and has since worked in several fields as an entrepreneur, counselor, and actor, while pursuing various eclectic interests over the decades. In her free time, she travels and lectures frequently about spirituality, metaphysics, but concentrates her research in UFOlogy. She's an outspoken human rights advocate and animal rights activist. It is her true desire to spread her positive message to as many people as possible, hoping it will resonate with like-minded individuals as she strives relentlessly to dispel fear and bring peace to a troubled planet. Please welcome to the show, Andrea Perron. Welcome, Andrea.
Hi, Chris. Oh, it's so great to be with you, dear.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. Now, I know in the past you and I have met at some of the paranormal conventions, and I've had an opportunity to hear your story. I've also seen the movie, and we've shared some similarities with growing up, number one, being terrified at one point, seeing ghosts, but then also coming to terms with the fear and communicating with the spirits.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I'll tell you something. Right at the top of the show, anybody that does not know you personally probably has a sense of your power and your knowing, but I know you personally, and I have looked deeply into your eyes, your bizarre alien hybrid green eyes, and you know of what you speak. You have lived it, you have been there, you have done that, and I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be able to have a conversation with someone who gets it.
Yeah.
Because so many people out there, they want to have their paranormal podcast and, they'll call me, can we do an interview? Can we do an interview? And then I spend 2 hours dispelling the myths and the rumors and the fictional film, The Conjuring.
Right.
And it's, I don't mind clarifying the discrepancies. I never do. I will be doing it for the rest of my life. No, the Annabelle doll had absolutely nothing to do with our story, et cetera, et cetera. But when I can get into the depth and the breadth of the paranormal with someone who really has a profound knowledge base, it is an absolute pleasure for me, and I am truly looking forward to this discussion.
Well, no, thank you. I appreciate all the compliments, and for myself, too, it's nice to know that I'm not the only one that has had this type of experience, because, going back to your childhood when you were having these encounters, there's really nobody to turn to.
Right.
And
That's right.
And as you get older, you start thinking, man, am I the only one having this? Is there anybody else out there? I mean, you went through that, right?
Yes, we did. And in fact, being raised to be honest, forthright children, when we were having these experiences, we were sharing them with our new friends in our new town. And then they, of course, were talking about it. And before we knew it, we were being bullied and made fun of. And we learned very quickly to shut our mouths and not share it with anybody, because it was very hurtful. And we were trying to assimilate into new schools and make new friends and have new teachers, and everything was new. And we lived in a supremely old haunted house, and, never the twain shall meet. It was a taboo subject then. And, much less so now, of course. People's minds have expanded and broadened on the subject, incrementally over the course of the decades. But at that time in the early 70s, we felt very much alone, very isolated, and even our father didn't believe what we were telling him. And we felt, that sense of abandonment. My mother was going through her own issues in the house, and we were having our experiences. And he was, he admits now, all these decades later, that the reason that he couldn't wrap his mind around it was because basically he was a fear-based carbon unit, and he felt terrible that he had moved his family into a house that might pose a threat to them on some level, and he just couldn't believe. He was king of denial for a couple of years before he had his experiences.
Yeah, and they usually are. And for the listeners, just to go a little bit of background, some details here for everybody listening, is, Andrea Perron's family, Carolyn and Roger, bought a house in Harrisville, Rhode Island, in the countryside.
Mm-hmm.
It was about 200 acres. It was a small farmhouse. Tell him a little bit about
that. No, it was huge.
Oh, it was
huge?
It
was a huge farmhouse.
Oh, it was? Oh.
Yeah, enormous. Yep.
Well, I guess when it's 200 acres, it's hard to think how big it might be.
Yeah.
But tell the listeners, when was this property deeded? How many generations of family lived there? And when did you guys move in? There's a rich history to this place, right?
Yes, there really is. Well, at the time that the colonies were being founded in New England, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was, first and foremost. They all came over and said, "Oh, we seek religious freedom." And then when we got there, they said, "Well, if you don't believe what we do, you need to leave." And Roger Williams, who had come from England with them, was basically thrown out of the colony while he was sick in the dead of winter in a snowstorm, I'm sure they presumed he would die. Wow. And the Indians actually rescued him and brought him to what is now Rhode Island. And he founded that colony on a dual premise: separation of church and state, and freedom to worship as you please. That's the basic tenet of the founding of the colony of Rhode Island. And then, of course, as the colonies burgeoned, Connecticut was encroaching from the west. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was encroaching from the north and the east. Mm. And so he founded the colony and then deeded it. The name of the state the official name is Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. That's the official name, the longest name for the smallest state. And what he did was he deeded out huge, vast tracts of land to families, to the original families that followed him to the colony because they believed in his philosophy. And the Richardson family is actually the ones that built the farmhouse. The land was deeded in 1680. The house as it stands now was completed in 1736, 40 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Actually, John Smith, like Pocahontas and John Smith,
right.
He's the one that did the survey on the property. And it was originally thousands of acres, and it created the corner between Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. The whole northeast corner was the Richardson plantation, and it later, through marriage, became the Arnold estate. And the Arnolds also followed. They were Quakers, and they were abolitionists, and they actually used the house during the Civil War as a part of the Underground Railroad to get slaves up to Canada. It does have an extensive, truly rich history, but 8 generations of one extended family lived and died in that house.
Jeez.
Prior to our arrival, and I would say probably a dozen of them never felt compelled to leave.
Now, in the time when you guys moved in to this home, it was about, 1970, 1971?
Yes, we purchased the house. My mother found it in June of 1970. My parents moved heaven and earth to buy this 200-acre estate, and they had the closing in December of 1970. So technically we owned it and had visited it many times during those months. Right. And we all loved it, and none of us recall ever having any supernatural activity or seeing anything untoward. My mother, it wasn't, ghosts and spirits was not even on the radar. Mm-hmm. My mother was enthralled with this magnificent, authentic colonial home, and she was interested in the history. It never occurred to her that the house might be haunted. That was not something that we ever talked about or considered. We were just little kids. I was only 12 when we moved in, and my youngest sister was 5. But the day we moved in, we went from being a perfectly normal family to a paranormal family. And it was in the middle of a swirling snowstorm, and we finally, it felt like we were crawling from our former home in Cumberland all the way out to the farm because we couldn't go above maybe 20, 25 miles an hour. The streets were just ice. But it was moving day, and if you're a good steadfast Yankee, you move in the snow. And when we got there, Dad threw open the back of the moving van and handed me a box marked kitchen and said, take this to your mother, who was in the kitchen with April. I went to the closest door I could find, which was the parlor door, and took a hard right into the dining room, and there was Mr. Kenyon, who we adored. I mean, lovely man that sold us the property. And he was packing up the last of his belongings out of the built-in china hutch in the corner of the room. And I greeted him, and, it was just so great to see him again, and we were chatting for a moment, and then I looked and I noticed that there was another man standing in the room with them who appeared absolutely solid to me, Chris, absolutely solid, to the extent that as I passed by him with the box for the kitchen, I said, good morning, sir, and he looked right through me. He was absolutely fixated on watching Mr. Kenyon pack. And, later I realized he was, for all intents and purposes, he was there to, wish him well and say goodbye.
Wow.
But Mr. Kenyon didn't see him either. I did. And then my sister Christine walks in the kitchen, and she's like, Mom, who's that man with Mr. Kenyon? He's dressed funny. And my mom's like, there's nobody with Mr. Kenyon, honey. His son's on the way. He's not here yet. And then Cindy came in, asked the same question. My mother kind of cocked her head sideways like, girls, really? And then Nancy came in and leaned over to Cindy, and she said, did you see that man with Mr. Kenyon? Well, so did I, and he just disappeared. Wow. And that was our entrance into the netherworld, and it persisted for 10 years that we lived at that farm. We left in June of 1980. It was the darkest period of our lives, and likewise the most enlightening period of our lives. All of us learned about life and death and the afterlife living at the Harrisville house.
Now, you wrote a book about this, and you call it The House of Darkness, House of Light?
Yes, and the reason that it's titled that, my mother is the one that titled the book. It was supposed to be one book. It burgeoned with everyone's stories forthcoming into 3. And my publisher said this is going to have to be a trilogy. First of all, it's just too intense and too dark in many spots to really publish it as a bold book. It needs to, you need to give your reader a break and break this up. And I agreed with them. It was 1,500 pages total for the whole story to be told. And it covers before we moved into the farm, and then it extends beyond us leaving the farm. And the reason that it does was because our experience needed to be reconciled, and we thought that when we left the farm that we would be leaving the spirits behind, and nothing could have been further from the truth. Right. Profound attachments were formed and have persisted lifelong. I know you picked up on that when I saw you last year in Disney. I mean, you looked at me like I had 16 spirits around me, and in fact, when I lectured at that event, I got photographs back from people that attended that event that had shadow figures around me. I was interrupted 3 times during my lecture with them, chatting it up and telling me what to say and what direction to go in. And I was like, wait a minute, you never do this to me. You never do this to me when I was trying to, back off and let me do what I need to do here. And I swear, it was because of the energy that you brought into the room, that Nene Grace brought into the room, that there were so many immersed para people in that particular room at that particular time. There were streaks of lights going around the room. I mean, I have never done a lecture at any venue that was as active as that one, and I blame you for this.
Thanks. I get blamed for a lot of things, and that's one of them. When I saw you, I saw all these things still around you. Getting at you, some that you're familiar with, some you weren't familiar with, just because they're recognizing what you've been through. And I think I said something to you like, they still bother you, don't they? Or something like that. And they're still around, aren't they? It was something to that nature. And you're like, oh, yeah. She goes, it's once you've had that experience as a child not just one experience. Sometimes people have one or two experiences, and that's all they have the rest of their life. But
Right.
for something your family went through, something that I had gone through, and other people I've gotten to know, is when you have these continuous hauntings and these interactions and encounters, is it changes you. It not only does it change you the way you see the world, but it changes your perception and awareness, your sixth sense, to where now you can sense when they're around. And not only do you sense when they're around, but they sense when you're around because you're conscious of them.
Yes, absolutely. You are absolutely spot on about that. When you are touched by spirit, it opens a door that can never be closed again. And you can turn your back on it and deny it if you wish. But eventually something is going to reach through that opening and tap you on the shoulder and make its presence known. And you spent your childhood immersed in the same type of activity that I did. And when your third eye is pried wide open, you can never close it again. You cannot unexperience something. You cannot unthink something or unhear something or unsmell something. It becomes impaled in your memory for life. And it is, but I don't have any regrets about that because I have lived, I think, a fuller life than people that don't have these experiences. And I'll give you a case in point. I went to early vote today because I'm going to be in Hollywood the day of the election. So I went to vote today, and I'm standing in line next to a man, and as soon as I stood next to him, I felt like something said, tell him. And I'm like, tell him what? And so we started chatting, and I mentioned, he said, I think I might recognize you. And I told him who I was. And he's like, oh, my God, I just saw your movie last week. No wonder I recognize you. And I said, well, I wasn't actually in the movie, but yes. He said, no, but I Googled it. And we ended up talking. And I turned and I looked at him after I felt comfortable. And I said, your uncle is standing beside you. He's 6'6" tall. He died last year at 86. He has bright blue eyes and silver gray hair. He was in a wheelchair, but he's not anymore. And he wants you to know that he loves you and loves you, and that you almost had a car accident last night, that he intervened on your behalf to protect you. And the man started to sob in my arms.
Wow.
I mean, and we're standing in line getting ready to vote. And everybody's looking at us like, oh, my God, this is so weird. What is going on here? And, and I said, make no mistake. His name's Kevin. I said, make no mistake, Kevin. I was supposed to encounter you today. I had a message for you, and here it is. And he loves you with all of his heart and soul, and he will never leave you. And my 15 minutes with that man today changed his life. And that's my mission. That's my role. I take it very seriously. He's like, are you a medium? Are you a psychic? I'm like, no, no. I don't label myself as anything because I'm a little bit of everything.
Right. When you lived in the house, obviously now you've got a connection with spirit, and that was built upon over many years of having these encounters with spirits. Can you recollect the first conscious encounter where you began to communicate back and forth, meaning that you may have thought something, said something, and you received a direct response from the ghost or the spirit, whether it was them reacting physically with their spirit, or you started getting information into your head, which is one of the ways they communicate? Can you recollect the first time you remember that?
That is hands down the best question that I have ever received on an interview, and no one has ever asked me that before. Oh my God, yes I do. I was probably 14. We'd probably been in the house a couple of years, and my mom had picked up a beautiful old rocking chair from an auction in town because the room that she put it in was rather sparse with furniture. And I was playing my guitar and singing a song to my sister Nancy that I had written about her. And the rocking chair started to rock. And Nancy looked at it, and she looked at me, and then she looked back at the chair, and it was rocking in perfect rhythm to my song. And she said, "Stop playing." And I did. And the chair stopped rocking. And then she said, "Okay, play it again." And the chair started rocking again. And it was playful, and it was lighthearted. It was delightful because I knew I couldn't see the spirit that was sitting in the chair.
Right.
I couldn't see her, but I knew it was a female, and I'm pretty sure I know who it was. And she was just enjoying the music and being with us. And it was very peaceful. There was nothing malevolent about it, nothing threatening about it. It was a point of contact. It was a point of acknowledgement of each other. And I remember feeling a sense of epiphany, of feeling just elated that we had that communication between each other. And then that opened the floodgates for me to the extent I was never attacked. I was never mistreated. I never had a negative altercation with a spirit in the 10 years that we lived there. My fear and trepidation was around what was happening to my mother and a couple of my sisters that were being repeatedly haunted and taunted by something that was not pleasant or, that was nefarious. And there was one female spirit in the house that really loathed my mother and had some bizarre attraction for my father, and she coveted us, the 5 children, and she perceived herself to be the mistress of the house. And my mother is the one that posed a threat to her. And she was the only one that caused a problem, and the rest of them, no issues at all. I'm so glad you asked me that because, there is light. It was both. House of Darkness, House of Light. It was both.
Right.
It was it was a splendid encounter. It was lovely. And, people might listen to that and go, "Oh, she is off her rocker," no pun intended. But, when you've had that kind of contact and you've made that kind of connection with spirit, it is truly moving. It changes you, as you said earlier, in fundamental ways. Right. It changes, alters your perspective. It opens your mind and expands your consciousness in ways that nothing else can.
No, you're right. And a lot of people listening to this, they're hearing your story and they've seen the movie The Conjuring, and it's hard because I have a lot of people that say, "Hey, what'd you think of The Conjuring? Is it true? Is it this or that?" And I went with one of my friends. She's like, "I want to go see that movie. Will you go with me?" I said, "Sure, I'll go with you." And we enjoyed it, and I liked the movie. It was entertaining, but it's Hollywood, and they have to turn it something and make it scary and all that. Were you happy with the movie The Conjuring? And in your opinion, how accurate was the film compared to your family's true story?
Not a single scene in The Conjuring came directly from my books. Not one.
Wow.
And I don't know if, I had my books so tied up contractually that even though I gave them permission to use our story as authentically as possible, when the screenwriters attempted to integrate it with the case files of the Warren, which is predominantly what the film was based on.
Right. Okay.
The big brass at Warner Brothers sent it back 7 times and said, "Tone this down; it'll run people right out of the theater." So they opted to go for formula, for the method.
Right.
What they thought would be palpable to the average viewing audience. There was no exorcism that happened in the house. My mother didn't know who Ed and Lorraine were when they showed up at our door. She never bought them out. But there were elements of the story that were true about the clock stopping every time there was a major manifestation. It wasn't at 3:07. It was actually at 5:15 a.m.
That's
right
crazy.
at dawn. And that clock is hanging on my wall in my dining room right now, and it works perfectly.
Well, let me ask you that. Stop right there, because my listeners will be familiar with 5:15, because I had an experience a year ago, January 2015, where I got within 24 hours the number 515, such as my clock went off 515 in the morning. Even though it wasn't even set, it was making this bell sound, which woke me up, and I reached for it, and a voice says, "Remember this number." Then at the airport, when I was in the line for McDonald's, my ticket number was 517, and I laughed, saying, "Oh, it could have been 515." And a voice said, "Look up." I look up, and it says, "Now serving 515." Then my flight was leaving at 5:15 in the morning. So within less than just 24 hours or so, there was 5:15 three times, which was a sign. And there was a sign. In my other podcasts, I talk about that. But I'm curious about, what do you think the 5:15 meant for you and the clock? What did it mean?
Well, in terms of the synchronicity between us that you're discussing, that's cosmic forces. And I think that that's undeniable. But we are attached. We have spoken at length. We have shared our experiences. And so that's not surprising to me. But the reason that the clock stopped is because the three major manifestations, the threatening manifestations that occurred in our home with my mother in her own bedroom, with my father laying dormant as if dead beside her, all began at 5:15 a.m., right at the crack of dawn. And once it was over, once my mother begged God for release and for assistance, "God help me," is the only thing that ever stopped it, ever, and uniformly stopped whatever crisis was occurring in the house. We all knew that just being deeply and profoundly prayerful would stop the crisis.
So do you think the 5:15 was like a warning, or was it some force that was causing the 5:15 to occur? I'm just...
Well, I don't know for sure. I wish that I could answer that definitively, but I can't.
Right.
But I do know that the clock stopped when the manifestations began. And it always did, to the extent that my father just gave up on it and never even bothered to wind it or move it or anything again while it was in the house. He moved it 3 times, thinking, maybe the wall was uneven or something, but no, it wasn't that. Of course it wasn't that.
Right.
But every time that my mother had an event occur, the clock beside her bed stopped when the event occurred at 5:15, and the grandfather clock stopped at 5:15. And so they used that, and they integrated that element into the film. Very well that Ed Warren was the only layman on the planet that had been trained in to assist in an exorcism. The only man not of the cloth.
Correct.
He was devout Roman Catholic, as is Lorraine. And so the film tried to juxtapose the devout Roman Catholic Warrens to the pagan, Perron, godless heathens, which they represented as our family. And nothing could have been further from the truth. My father was born and raised steeped in the Catholic tradition, went to parochial school, was an altar boy for his entire youth, and was on his way to the priesthood when he met my mother, and that changed everything. Yeah. We were all born Catholic. We were all baptized. We were confirmed into the church. And the sad truth of it is that our parish priest in Harrisville had gotten wind of what was going on at the farm. Of course, it was a rumor mill. It was a small town. Everybody was chatting it up about the Perrons. And on Easter Sunday in 1973, we all went to church, as we did together as a family on all the major holidays. And during the Mass, up on the altar, the priest said, "And the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." And my little sister April turned to my mother, and at the top of her lungs, she said, "See, Mommy, God has ghosts too."
Wow.
And the priest just about passed out on the altar, and every head in the church turned and stared at our family. And as we were leaving the church, the priest came up behind us and he asked my father to take our family and worship elsewhere. And that's when we left the church.
Oh.
My father felt absolutely abandoned by the religion that he had been a part of his whole life. And so that's the truth of it, So, and I think that, I can talk to you about this because you are so well aware that the vast majority of people that encounter spirit in such extremes like this are actually very spiritual, very devout people.
Right.
They're not godless pagan heathens.
Right.
That they are actually attached. And, they made it look in the film like, we didn't have a picture of Jesus hanging on every wall. We didn't have a crucifix every 3 feet. No, we didn't. But that didn't mean that we weren't spiritual and that we weren't attached to our church and our religion, at all. And the film tried to, create this impression that if you're not a spiritually based religious person, that you're vulnerable to attack. And that's not fair to put that kind of portrayal out into the world because it qualifies as misinformation.
Right. Well, in the movie, they show that there's an exorcism that's being done, but that wasn't the case. It was just a seance. Can you share with the listeners what occurred during the seance?
Well, first of all, Ed would never, even Lorraine started crying when I watched the film with her. She and I were out in Hollywood about 3 months before the film opened, and Warner Brothers graciously brought us out there for a private screening. And when that scene came up, she got very upset, and I had to hand her the box of tissues. And it was emotional for us. My sister Cindy was with me, and Tony, her son-in-law, was with her as her escort for the trip. And it was emotional for us. There were several things that I'll mention to you shortly about the film that just set off bells in my head. Like, how could they possibly have known that and included this in the film? How could they have known that? But, and I'll revisit that in a moment. But that particular scene really upset her because as she looked over, she leaned forward and leaned over into my face and put her face right against mine and spoke into my ear. And she said, Ed would never have done that. And I just turned and I just cupped my hand around her cheek, and I said, I know, Lorraine, I know. It's only a movie. And she's like, yeah, but Ed would never have done that. He had way too much respect for the church to try to, and I'm like, I know, sweetheart. And then I talked to her about it later. She was very upset about that because, he was trained as an assistant, but there was no exorcism. My mother was not possessed. My mother was brutally attacked. And I blame the medium for it, not Lorraine and not Ed. They were trying to help us. I will go to my grave believing that Ed and Lorraine Warren were not there to exploit us. They came to try to help us. And Lorraine admitted that they were in over their heads right from the inception, that they had never encountered anything like our family's situation, and that it got away from them. But they did the best that they could. And they came to the house that night with a priest, with a medium, with a film crew, an audio crew. They had about 7 people total. My sister Nancy was the only one that was not home. Now, I will say that what transpired never should have happened with children in the house. It never should have.
Correct, right.
But
now, your mom
heard it.
Your mom did have some type of attachment, though, didn't she? Something that was oppressing her?
She did. I would say that my mother was oppressed.
She wasn't fully possessed yet. Those were the beginning stages of a possible possession, where you have the oppression, wearing the person down. They're tired all the time. They can't sleep. They're being disturbed at night. They start having anxiety or behavior issues.
And drastic weight loss. I mean, my mother's a little woman anyway, but she was just, it was awful. But it was even beyond that, Chris. She was doing massive amounts of research on the property. When she realized that the house was haunted, she said they're not just passing through by accident, that these spirits are somehow attached to the house. And she started doing an inordinate amount of work in the town archives and the library trying to find out the history of the house and who it might be. the pragmatic Virgo that she is, she wanted an explanation for it. And my father was still, in denial. He didn't want to hear about it. He didn't want to know the Warrens. He didn't trust them. He thought they were there to take advantage of our family and the situation. And he was as uncooperative as you can possibly imagine. That the film made him all warm and fuzzy and welcoming was like a joke. Even he said, that's not how that happened. But of course, it was to glorify the Warrens. And
right.
So, of course, they made it look the way that they did, but that was not the truth of the situation. And when they showed up at the house that night, he was livid. He had just he had been gone for at least a week or more, and all he wanted to do was come home and put his feet up and watch the Red Sox game. And when my mother told him at dinner that the Warrens had called and that they were going to stop by, they never told her more than that. She expected the two of them to show up. Well, he was totally ticked off just at that notion. But when they pulled into the yard with a caravan and a film crew and everything else, I thought his head was going to blow off his shoulders. And the negative energy just oozed from him. So technically, he was feeding the beast. And my mother was suffering what I would consider oppression. Right. She was dressing in vintage clothing. She was starting to use archaic language, referring to the men in town as yeomen. That language was archaic 150 years prior to when we moved into the house.
So who do you think
and
this...
at first I thought perhaps it was because she was steeped in the history and was just picking up the language that she was reading, but it was far more than that. And they foisted that seance on my parents, and Lorraine went so far. Lorraine is not so demure as she might appear. Right. And I remember her looking directly into my father's eyes and saying to him, if you love your wife, you'll let us do this.
Right.
And he was ripped. Ed had to take him out of the room, took him off into the bedroom, was in there for about 45 minutes with him and the priest, trying to explain to my father why this was a necessity, that Carolyn was being taken from her family, right, and that they were going to try to intercede on her behalf. Right. Well, he really made a big show of being very anti-everything paranormal that night, but he finally allowed it to go forward. By that point, Chris, I can't describe my mother as anything more than catatonic. Her head was drooped down. She was sitting in a chair by herself. She was non-responsive. She couldn't even speak. It was like she was shutting down. Correct. And I don't know if it was from all that pervasive negative energy coming from my father, or fear that things were going to get out of hand, or if she was just leaving us. But the fact of the matter is, and this is the God's honest truth, that night my mother was the weakest link at that table. And when the medium, Mary Pastorella, sat down and started pulling out all of her accoutrement and all the stuff that she had in her pouch and putting it on the table, and the lighting of the candles, and the cameras were set up downstairs, and people were walking around taking photographs, and there was a big-ass reel-to-reel going on, and all of this was going on, and I'm hiding from a vantage point where I could see all of it. I had my sister Cindy with me. My sister was hiding in her bed directly over the dining room where this was happening, with her head covered up, trying not to hear anything. And April had snuck down the side of the stairs to my room in the parlor and was watching from there. It's very bad that we were in the house to see what we saw. And so Mary started, conjuring the spirits and opening wide the doors to the netherworld and inviting everyone in so that she could determine who the culprit was that was causing the problem. You know, and I know that is nothing short of spiritual malpractice.
Right. So it wasn't Lorraine Warren that opened that door. It was some other medium.
No.
Oh,
yeah,
God! I thought it was always Lorraine. Okay.
Yep. Nope. Lorraine was just as shocked as anybody else at that table when she saw what happened. And what happened was that something infested my mother in those moments, and her body began to. At first she started like moaning. Like it was a deep guttural moan, and it turned into a growl, and then it turned into a howl, and her whole body drew up into the chair that she was sitting in like she was trying to be turned into some kind of a ball, to the extent that you would expect her bones to snap. And you would hear it. I mean, it was horrific to watch. And then she started, and her head just bolted up, and she started speaking in a voice that was not her own, in a language that does not exist on this planet. And everybody, the priest leapt up from the table and went over and was quaking in the corner of the room. I mean, everybody started freaking out. The table levitated about 2 or 3 feet off the inches off the floor, and then slammed down onto the floor as if the hand of God himself had landed in the center of it. It left an impression in the wood for the 4 legs that's there to this day. And then my mother's chair began to lift and lift and lift. And when she was about 2 feet off the floor, in a split second, her chair was tossed with her in it from the middle of our dining room about 12 feet away. And when she hit the parlor floor, her skull hit the floor, and everyone in the house heard it. And everyone present in that house that night thought they had just watched my mother die. And I promise you, whatever it was that came into her that night had all the power that it could have ever needed to kill her. It didn't want to kill her, or it would have. It wanted to make its presence known to the medium and the priest and the Warrens and everyone else there. And when Ed tried to stop my father from going to my mother, he grabbed him by the arm, and my father turned around and cold-cocked him, broke his nose, and took him to the floor.
Jeez.
And then threw everybody out of the house as he was trying to revive my mother from what was obviously a severe concussion. And Lorraine ordered the cinematographers to go back down into the cellar and retrieve their camera equipment. And about 2 minutes later, those men came running up the cellar stairs, sobbing, because their state-of-the-art, high-tech camera equipment for 1974 was shattered in hundreds of pieces all over the cellar wall and floor.
Wow.
So something had picked it up on the tripods and slammed it into the granite walls. And they ran out of the house and put themselves in the van, and they never came back in. And the woman who was running the reel-to-reel closed the whole thing up, and she left the house. The priest left the house. Mary Pastorella passed out on the table, and she had to be lifted and revived and taken out of the house. It was hell on wheels. It was the worst experience of my life. I never want to relive anything like it again, and I thank God every single day of my life that my mother has absolutely no memory of the event.
Yeah, usually they don't remember. Did you ever find out what entity or who or what did that to her?
Well, none of them ever walked up to us and said, "Hello, my name is." Right. You know, and I know that's not how it works. But I can guarantee you that it was not Bathsheba Sherman. The spirit that was haunting and taunting my mother was very likely Mrs. Arnold, who decided to hang herself in the barn in the late 1700s after her husband passed away, and she was 93 years old. And that's what the town historian told us when we moved in. He didn't have any use for Bathsheba. He knew her. He knew her as a boy. When she was a very old woman. She lived from 1812 to 1885. But chances are very good that the spirit that went after my mother was long dead before Bathsheba was ever born.
Right.
And Bathsheba was not a member of the Arnold family. She married Judson Sherman and lived at the Sherman farm, which was about a mile away from our farm as the crow flies. She did have some attachment to the house. When Lorraine first showed up with Ed on the evening before Halloween, in 1973, my mother had no idea who they were. She graciously, invited them into the house. They looked harmless enough. She thought their car had broken down and they needed to use the phone. And when they came in, they introduced themselves and who they were. And then Lorraine just walked right past her and went over to the corner of the black stove in our kitchen, placed her hand on the corner of it, covered her eyes, and said, "I sense a malignant presence in this house. Her name is Bathsheba." Now, I give her all credit for that because she had no idea what the history of the house was or who might be attached to it at the time. But the other side of that coin was that from that point on. Anything nefarious, malignant, malevolent that occurred in that house, she automatically blamed on Bathsheba.
Right.
And it was Bathsheba. I have been in touch with Bathsheba through George, through spirit box sessions, at her gravestone. I have had communication with her throughout my life. I recognized her voice immediately the first time I heard it through the spirit box.
Right.
And she is not the one that was after my mother, not at all. And the spirit that was used language that was already
Ancient.
out of
it was very ancient. Yeah.
1800. Yeah.
Yeah.
'Twas mistress once afore ye came, and mistress here will be anon. No, those words were not even used in the 1800s.
Yeah,
anymore.
no. What you've got is you're dealing with an ancient entity. It could be one of the fallen. It could be one of the giants or the creatures that were wiped out from the Great Flood. But the fact of the matter is entities that will speak in tongues and speak these multiple languages, they're thousands of years old. And the reason why they're speaking those languages is because they have witnessed and experienced many civilizations, many languages, many cultures. And with that knowledge, they've gained the ability to know all languages. So that kind of like, it's like a kind of an ego thing, is they're making a statement or they're saying something, but because they're so powerful knowledge-wise, they will say it in multiple languages as it comes off their tongue, rolling from one language to the next. And that's basically telling us that, wow, these things are ancient spirits. They've been here probably since the time of the flood. And that's all it is, any other spirit that had been around a long period of time like that too may be familiar with some of those languages also. Now, in some of your encounters, spiritual encounters that you've seen with the ghosts in this house when you lived there, what other types of ghosts have you seen? Did you see shadow people, lights? Did you see any type of creatures, or was it normally just human spirits?
No, it was everything that you just said and more. Depending on how much energy, as you well know, they have to get it from somewhere, whether they're pulling it from, the actual family members, or if they're pulling, our electricity bill would go through the roof. It would be higher than the mortgage prior to major manifestation, and then it would drop down to nothing afterward, in the aftermath. That was represented as well, I believe, in the film. It was, I saw every different kind of manifestation, and I think everybody else in the family did too, whether it was a swirling blue mist that Cindy would run through, and it would be like ice cold, and it would knock her over. The spirit that tried to come to my father and manifest in form, and he got angry at her and told her to go back down to the cellar where she belonged, and she slammed the door and then wouldn't have anything to do with him for 6 months, because they've got feelings too, and he hurt her feelings because she was the one that loved him so much. But we had benevolent spirits in the house too. There was an older woman that would make the rounds of the bedrooms at night. And just as we were falling off to sleep, we could almost feel her lips on our forehead kissing us goodnight, right, third eye kisses. And we knew it wasn't our mother because she always smelled like ivory soap. And this spirit smelled like an intoxicating mixture of flowers and fruit. And so we knew it wasn't Mom. And she was very protective of us, and she watched over us. And the spirit that we all saw the day we moved in, my sister named him Manny, although he was probably Johnny Arnold, who crawled up into the eaves to drink some horse liniment to get drunk and accidentally killed himself doing it in the 1850s. We don't know for a fact if it was Mrs. Arnold, if it was Johnny Arnold, if it was Susan Arnold, if it was Bathsheba Sherman, if it was Prudence Arnold. We don't know, and we'll never know, not in this lifetime. But, when I talk about this, I tell people, at this point, it really doesn't matter. That they exist at all is the freaking miracle.
Right.
That's what's important, that they exist, and that they tried to communicate with us, and that they successfully did communicate with us once we acknowledged them and opened ourselves up to them. And, a lot of people out there that are steeped in this will say, oh, my God, the last thing you should do is try to contact them or, speak with them or open yourself to them. You leave yourself so incredibly vulnerable. Well, once we did that, that's when everything seemed to calm down. And my mother's moment of epiphany, I mean, my mother went through hell in that house. And whatever came into her that night at the seance was so evil, so dark, so ugly. It silenced the spirits for about 2 months. And I remember the night that all changed, because at that point, I was 15, and I had literally become like the third parent. I was taking care of my sisters. My mother had no strength left, no will, nothing in her, no enthusiasm for life at all. She was just existing. And so I would make dinner, help my sisters with their homework, get them to bed. My mother came out of her bedroom at 11 o'clock that night. I was sitting on the sofa, finally getting my homework done. And she came out of her room. She looked like the walking dead. She looked awful. Big, huge black circles under her eyes, waif-like. And she said, "Honey, I'm hungry." When that was music to my ears, I hopped right up. I said, "I made beef stew for the girls tonight. I'll go and I'll warm some up for you." And she said, "And make me a pot of coffee." And I was like, "Mom, it's 11 o'clock at night. You want coffee?" She's like, "I want nectar of the gods. I want coffee." So there were no microwaves. I had to go through I had closed the house down for the night. The dining room was dark. I walked through the dark dining room, past the piano, past the table, into the front foyer, into the kitchen, into the pantry, started the coffee, and warmed up some beef stew for my mother. So I was gone probably 10 or 15 minutes. When I came back into the dining room, which was completely dark, I looked into the parlor, and there was my mother standing on the hearthstone of the parlor, glowing. There was an aura of pure white light around her, and a smile as broad as I have ever seen in my life. And I was like, "Oh my God, what happened?" And she said, "Now I understand. Now I understand." In my absence, she had reached around to get a log out of the firebox and throw the last log of the night on the fire. And as she was placing the screen back in front, she heard laughter behind her. And she turned around, and there was an entire family sitting at a table that was not our own. There was a woman standing in front of a fireplace that had been sealed for more than 100 years when we bought the place, cooking over a raging fire. There were children running around the room, and there were two men sitting on a bench on the other side of the table. She was telling the kids to take their place. She was ready to serve dinner, and the table was lit with oil lamps and candles, and the men had pewter steins in front of them. You know your history. That's indicative of the 1700s. Pewter was outlawed in the 1800s because it was poisoning people. And the man that was closest to her peered into the parlor for a moment, and he made direct eye contact with my mother, and then he nudged the man beside him and pointed her out, and Mom was the ghost. To them, she was the ghost. So she was peering into the past as they were simultaneously looking into the future. And that's when it made sense to my mother that we were living in a portal cleverly disguised as a farmhouse, and that we were existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And that's when she came back to us.
Wow. I mean, you got so much that was going on there. We've got a couple minutes left in the interview. I wanted to ask you, how has your life changed since writing the books?
In every conceivable way. I live blissfully because now I understand why I'm here and what my mission is. I went through some depression right after I finished the third book. And George kind of lifted me out of that. He called me late one night and he said, "Are you doing okay?" Because I was having visions of my own demise, like I had already served my purpose, why I was here. I mean, I was not in a good place. And he said, "Well, let me tell you a story." And so for 2 hours, he told me this incredible story. And when he was done, I said, "Oh, my God, George, you have to write that down." And he said, "I'm a thinker, not a writer." I said, "I'm a writer. I'll help you write it. I'll help you." And we spent 18 months working on what became the novel in a flicker. And I am as proud of that book as I am of the trilogy. Not only did it extricate me from what was, for all intents and purposes, postpartum depression, once I had birthed my triplets and felt like absolutely useless. But it was also a very, very important story to tell. And yes, it's extremely gruesome. It is, the worst of it is extricated directly from the annals of history. But In a Flicker is about the only plausible explanation that I've ever heard for why Jack the Ripper was never apprehended. Oh. And it is an amazing piece of literature. In fact, when we're done, send me your address and I'll pop a copy off to you, sweetheart, because, complimentary is a gift from both of us, because you need to read this book, Chris. You need to read this book. Everybody needs to read this book. This is part of the Great Awakening. This is part of spiritual ascension. This story will change the way you think about everything in much the same way, with the same effect that the trilogy has on people. Even though it's entirely separate subject matter, it serves the same purpose. And I would be thrilled to send you a copy, sweetheart.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I look forward to it. And for everybody listening, you can get the book In a Flicker at www.inaflickernovel.com. And then also the trilogy of books, House of Darkness, House of Light. You can pick those up at www.houseofdarknesshouseoflight.com. That's houseofdarknesshouseoflight.com. You can also contact Andrea there if you have any questions. Andrea, I want to thank you very much for being on the show. We covered a lot, and I know we could cover so much more, but we're out of time. What does the future hold for you?
Well, I hope that I come back and we'll just pick up where we left off sometime, because you are absolutely delightful, and I love being with you in cyberspace or in person or in any way I can get you. And I'll tell you, I'm leaving for San Antonio tomorrow. Then I'm going out to Los Angeles to cut a movie deal on the 3 books. Wonderful. And then I'm going to lecture at the Star Works Symposium in Nevada. And then when I get back to Florida, I'm doing a shoot for a documentary. And then I'm getting in the van and I'm driving to Georgia to spend Thanksgiving with my family there. And I'm putting my feet up, and I'm not doing anything for about 5 weeks.
Good for you. Well, it was a pleasure having you on, and I wish you the best of luck in all your ventures. I know we'll be hearing from you again. For everybody listening, This is Chris Fleming and Andrea Perron. You've been listening to this edition of Spirit Talk. I'll see you next month.